Rome didn't need a written law to control captive women. Silence was enough. After conquest, the law spoke loudly about victory, but it said almost nothing about what happened to women taken as spoils. That silence wasn't accidental. It created an unwritten rule. If the law didn't forbid it, power decided everything. And once you understand that rule, the Roman triumph, the chains, and the fates of captured queens start to make disturbing sense. Imagine a queen, once sovereign of a broad eastern realm, her crown exchanged not for iron shackles, but for chains of gilt and ornament, jewelry turned into instruments of subjugation, and led through a city that roared at her fall. That image, vivid and bitter, captures more than a single humiliation. It points to a pattern, an unwritten social legal rule in the Roman world that treated war captives, including elite women, as lawful objects of masters' control. The law gave permission to a practice. Custom and spectacle gave it meaning and force. Over the next stretch of the narrative, we will follow that rule from courtroom and camp to triumphal street, examine its consequences in several famous cases, and ask what it tells us about power, gender, and imperial theater in antiquity. If this subject matters to you, stay with the whole piece and subscribe for more deep historical explorations. To understand how such an unwritten rule could operate, we must begin with law and legal imagination. Roman attitudes toward captives were shaped by the ius gentium, a body of practice and principles that governed relations between Romans and non-Romans, and by traditions tracing back to the 12 Tables. These legal ancestors treated certain persons captured in war as res, things that could be owned, transferred, and disposed of by victors. Roman citizens possessed protections. The law that applied to them, however imperfect in practice, preserved certain statuses and rights. Foreign rulers, defeated city-states, and the many peoples labeled peregrini found themselves outside these domestic legal shields. In the aftermath of defeat, the transformation from free person to captive was not merely rhetorical. It had civil consequences. A captive's legal status shifted into the orbit of property law. Masters could buy and sell, manumit in some cases, or keep captives for life. What the written law made possible, enslavement as an outcome of war, was extended in practice by the customs of the army, the patronage economy of the elite, and the theatrical needs of the state. Law here matters, but so does what law did not say. There was no single statute that recorded, in the language of a modern penal code, a permission to seize the bodies of enslaved women for the private use of their masters. Instead, an array of legal precedents, military customs, and social expectations functioned together to normalize such outcomes. A conquered king could be sold, ransomed, paraded, or executed. A conquered queen could be displayed, handed over, or assigned as spoil. The absence of a prohibition mattered as much as the presence of rights for citizens. Where law remained silent or indifferent, social practice and military reward systems filled the vacuum. Enslavement followed defeat. Masters' prerogatives, including the control of enslaved persons' labor, mobility, and bodies, were recognized components of those prerogatives. If the law created a permission structure, Roman spectacle gave it a stage. The triumph was the ritual that crystallized conquest into a public drama. It was a theatrical procession where the triumphator's military achievements were displayed before the Roman populace. Captured standards, spoils, trumpeters, soldiers, and captives themselves. The triumph transformed private victory into public pedagogy. To watch a procession meant to read a lesson about Rome's power, the futility of resistance, and the humiliation that awaited those who opposed imperial arms. Spectacle worked on two levels. On the surface, it was celebration, feasting, public honor, and theater. Beneath, it embedded a vocabulary of domination. The captives who marched before the general were not merely passengers. They served as moving proof, bodies that testified to the triumph's completeness. The Mamertine prison, sometimes called the Tullianum, played a smaller, darker role in this choreography. For some prisoners, the parade through the city was only a prelude to execution. Ancient authors report that defeated leaders might be imprisoned in the Mamertine, exhibited as part of public ritual, and then quietly put to death. For others, survival became another form of punishment, humiliation in life, not merely death. The public display and the private disposal together constructed a moral and political message. Conquerors could decide whether a captive's fate would be spectacle, execution, or servitude. Each choice carried its own pedagogical effect for onlookers. To see this pattern at work, it helps to look at cases where ancient sources offer detail, always with a necessary caution about the source's limits and rhetorical aims. Take Zenobia, the Queen of Palmyra, whose rise and fall encapsulate the symbolic theft of status. Ancient writers report that Zenobia led a successful, expansionist polity across the eastern provinces until Aurelian's campaigns in the late 3rd century returned her realm to Roman control. According to the surviving accounts, Aurelian captured her and brought her to Rome, where she was included in his triumph. Some descriptions emphasize ornament, chains, possibly gilded, transformed into instruments of humiliation, the very symbols of a queen's regalia turned into trappings of captivity. We must note uncertainty. Late antique and sometimes politically charged sources offer varying details about her subsequent treatment and the precise imagery of her chains. But the enduring motif, the ruler reduced to a decorative but pitiful object in the triumph, speaks to a wider practice. The triumph did not only record victory, it converted the wealth and dignity of a defeated ruler into a public spectacle of property. Now consider a different corner of the empire and a different gendered violence with immediate political consequences. Tacitus reports that when the Roman procurator in Britain ordered the flogging and public humiliation of Boudica and the assault on her daughters, acts presented by ancient testimony as grounds for outrage, the result was catastrophic rebellion. Tacitus's account is blunt. The maltreatment of a queen and her children was treated as an assault not only on bodies, but on honor and sovereignty. For Boudica and her people, the violation became the spark that turned private insult into collective fury. The Roman response, meant as discipline and deterrence, had the opposite effect. The episode is instructive because it shows how gendered violence functioned as a mechanism of control and how, when misapplied, it could multiply the political cost of conquest. Tacitus writes with an evident moral lens, and scholars debate elements of his narrative, but the essential causal claim survives. Humiliation of elite women could provoke a social and military reckoning. These two stories, Zenobia's gilded chains and Boudica's flogging, are not isolated incidents. They are part of a pattern visible across other famous captives. Vercingetorix, the Gallic leader, was paraded in Caesar's triumph and then executed. Plutarch and Caesar's own commentaries leave a clear sequence. Jugurtha, the Numidian king, according to Sallust's narrative, was eventually humiliated in Rome after his capture, a demonstration to the populace that resistance could end in degradation rather than honorable fate. Simon Bar Giora, one of the leaders in the Judean revolts, is reported by Josephus to have been paraded in Titus's triumph, a vivid image of Judean resistance transformed into Roman spectacle before execution. Each case differs in form and outcome, but together they reveal recurring logic. Captives, whether killed immediately, publicly displayed, or kept as trophies, became instruments in a theatrical grammar meant to teach submission. Across these examples, we should be careful about attribution and motive. Ancient historians often narrated these events to underline moral lessons, to flatter victors, or to vilify enemies. They are not neutral observers, and they sometimes disagree on details. But even granting those constraints, a pattern emerges that moves beyond individual storytellers' biases. Law sanctioned slavery. Military culture and the economy of reward converted captives into prizes. The triumph provided a ritual valve for projecting imperial narratives. In the gaps between written law and ritual practice, social norms operated as tacit rules. This is the unwritten rule at the center of the title, not a statute, but a durable tacit agreement among lawmakers, commanders, soldiers, and civilians that war produced ownership, and with ownership came rights. What did those rights look like in practice? They were uneven and situational. Some captives, especially those of higher status, might be paraded to prove the conquest's completeness and then executed to close the political chapter. Others were distributed among soldiers as spoils, placed in households as laborers, or retained by commanders for various uses. Enslaved women, in particular, occupied multiple roles within the economy of domination. They could be domestic laborers, symbols of status for their new owners, or, more grimly, objects of sexual violence. Ancient sources sometimes record such uses obliquely or as anecdote rather than as systematic policy. Roman attitudes toward sexual access to enslaved women were complex, partly shaped by ideas about honor, status, and the distinction between citizen female chastity and the perceived expendability of non-citizen bodies. In legal terms, the master's control over the enslaved person's body was an accepted corollary of ownership. In social terms, the practice was normalized by a culture that linked conquest to masculine virtuosity and domination. Why did such a tacit rule persist? Part of the answer lies in the political utility of humiliation. Public spectacles demonstrated what Rome could do to those who opposed it. They made abstract claims of supremacy into immediate, visible lessons. Displaying a defeated ruler in chains told both allies and enemies what falling to Roman arms would cost. The theater of triumph, its music, banners, and paraded spoils, was a kind of mass communication in an age without newspapers. It operated to terrify, to flatter Roman audiences, and to naturalize conquest as a moral and political good. Within the ranks, the distribution of captives incentivized soldiers. War promised both glory and material reward. That the spoils included people, bodies that could be bought, sold, or kept, made the institution of war intimately tied to enslavement. But power as theater carried risks. Boudicca's uprising is a stark illustration of how gendered humiliation could catalyze resistance rather than suppress it. Where humiliation was aimed at elite women, figures whose honor carried political weight, the effect could be explosive. The Romans understood this risk, which partly explains the divergence of outcomes for different captives. Some were quietly executed, their deaths absorbing the threat of future insurrection. Others were displayed so as to insert them visibly into the imperial narrative. Still others were circulated through the economy of soldiers and households, their fates dispersed and less publicly potent, but no less devastating on the level of human life. We should also consider the internal dynamics among Romans themselves. How soldiers, commanders, and elites rationalized or dissociated from the violence they enacted. The triumph celebrated the commander's virtue and secured senatorial approval. The populace received spectacle and spoils. Soldiers received tangible rewards. These overlapping interests created an ecosystem in which the mistreatment of captives could be justified as necessary for order, celebration, or reward. Over time, customary practice hardened into expectation. The unwritten rule we describe was not imposed by a single decree, but produced by the routine alignment of incentives, rituals, and legal permissiveness. The human cost of this system is impossible to quantify, but not difficult to imagine. Captivity meant loss of status, freedom, and bodily autonomy. For elite women reduced to spectacle, the humiliation included a symbolic theft, the stripping away of sovereignty's marks, and the inversion of social roles. For others, enslavement meant years of labor, exploitation, and the possibility of sexual violence. Ancient authors sometimes register this cost, sometimes use it as a foil to an argument about virtue or vice. Modern readers must tread carefully. It is possible to analyze the social structures without diminishing the personal devastation they caused. Memory complicates matters further. The way these events were recorded shaped later interpretations. Authors who narrated triumphs and captures did so with agendas, praising victors, warning enemies, or moralizing about hubris. Where sources conflict or silence prevails, historians must reconstruct patterns from fragments, reading across legal texts, inscriptions, material culture, and literary accounts. That reconstruction shows both continuity and contingency. While many elements were standard, enslavement as an outcome of war, the use of captives in triumphal displays, the precise treatment of individual captives depended on political calculations, the temperament of commanders, and the reactions of local populations. There is a final political dimension worth naming. The public use of humiliation as policy, whether by spectacle or private deployment, was a tool to sustain hierarchies, imperial over provincial, conqueror over conquered, citizen over non-citizen. Gender was woven into these hierarchies. Elite women embodied both political authority and social honor. To strip one of symbol and to convert the other into a household object was to reassert dominance in the most visible way. The social acceptance of this dynamic, the gap between law as text and law as lived practice, made it possible for masters to use enslaved women with near impunity. That acceptance was itself a form of governance, consent manufactured through ritual, custom, and the routines of power. Returning to the opening image, Zenobia in gilt chains, what remains visible is not only the physical object, but the cultural logic that produced it. The unwritten rule was a product of multiple strands: legal permissiveness, military custom, public appetite for spectacle, and the social norms that regarded certain bodies as subject to disposal. It sanctioned, normalized, and often hid the violences of empire within the routines of reward and celebration. In the short term, such practices could make conquest efficient and deterrent. In the long term, they left wounds that festered as uprisings, cultural trauma, and contested memories. The accounts preserved by ancient writers, Tacitus, Plutarch, Josephus, Sallust, later epitomizers, do not always agree, and they must be read as both testimony and rhetoric. But when read together, they indicate that an unstated, enforced consensus allowed masters to treat enslaved women as instruments, whether for labor, display, or abuse. This is not an argument that flattens ancient difference into modern categories. It is not an attempt to retrofit contemporary legal language onto antiquity. Rather, it is an effort to see how law, custom, and spectacle combine to create predictable outcomes for captives. Whatever the legal terminology, the result was often the same. Conquered persons lost autonomy and dignity in ways that served imperial ends. That realization forces a difficult question about the politics of representation, how societies use public rituals to naturalize domination, and how those rituals, in turn, shape both immediate conduct and long-term memory. Consider, finally, the moral weight of the theater. Empire used the stage not only to celebrate, but to teach. The triumph instructed Romans about who they were and what their state could do. It also instructed subjugated peoples about the costs of resistance. The consequence was the normalization of dehumanization under the cover of ritual and legal indifference. Holding the image of a queen led in chains in our minds should not be an exercise in historical voyeurism. It should be a prompt to ask how political power can convert people into signs, whose meaning serves domination. It should push us to recognize the human toll behind the pageantry. If this account has been useful, consider sharing it with others who study empire, gender, or the history of violence. For further reading, consult translations of the ancient sources and modern studies of Roman triumphs and slavery. Links and recommendations are in the description. The gilded chains remain an enduring image. They remind us that law and custom can collude to render some human beings into objects, and that spectacle can hide cruelty beneath the colors of celebration. Remember the queen's face in the crowd, an image of political theft, and carry that scene as a lens for thinking about how public ritual and private power have worked together, in Rome and beyond, to take away dignity in the name of victory.